Thursday. It's 8 o'clock. We are streaming this hour live, which we always do on a Thursday because we have a guest in the studio and we have a bit of an interview and then we take calls. And today, Paul Nowak joins me. He's the General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress. He took over from Francis O'Grady back in January, so he's had a bit of a baptism of fire over the first 3 months in the job, which actually in some ways, I think in a way is a good thing because it doesn't give you... I mean, sometimes people want time to ease into a job, Paul. Welcome, by the way. But you haven't had any time to ease into it at all, have you?
Yeah. Cheers, evening, Ian. No time at all to ease into things. But, it has been good because I've had the opportunity to go up and down the country talking to thousands of union members, some of them on picket lines, in conferences, in meetings, in their workplaces. And good to see some life in the trade union movement and people standing up for decent pay rises, standing up to protect jobs and standing up to get the government to listen to them.
And what is the role of the TUC? Because obviously all of these individual disputes, you don't have a role in sort of solving them, but what is the role of the TUC at the moment in these individual disputes?
So if you like, the TUC is the union's union. We represent 48 unions, 5.5 million members. And I think I see my job very much about supporting our unions and their members through this cost of living crisis, which in large part is a wages crisis. It's why so many people are taking industrial action. That means making the public case for those workers who've taken the difficult decision to take strike action. It means lobbying government to get round the table with unions and negotiate a settlement to the disputes and take the demands of their workforce seriously. And I think it just means standing up for working people. And, as I say, those 5.5 million members, their families, their communities need a strong voice at work and beyond. And hopefully that's what the TUC provides.
And do you play a role in sort of maybe bringing the different unions together? Because let's take the nurses dispute or health service disputes. I mean, there are many unions involved here. You've got the RCN, you've got Unite, you've got the GMB, you've got Unison. And their strike ballots are going sort of slightly different ways, aren't they? How does that affect things?
Well, the RCN is a different case because they're not affiliated to the TUC. They're one of the few unions that aren't affiliated to the TUC. But all of our other health unions are talking all the time. And remember, they represent different groups of members who've got different priorities, different cultures within their unions. But I think they've held together, I think, remarkably well, worked together, tried to take their case jointly to the government, tried to take the case jointly to the public as well. But the same would apply for our teaching unions, our civil service unions. In fact, we bring our unions together right across the piece, public and private sector unions, talking to each other all the time, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want decent pay for the people we represent. We want good quality jobs. We want good public services, and we want successful businesses.
My point was, though, that Unison voted to accept the government's offer and the RCN didn't by 56 to 44. Not a huge margin. Now, the RCN immediately said, well, we're going to call some more strikes. So I think there's going to be legal action to try and prevent that. But the government can legitimately say, well, hang on a minute, you've got one of the biggest unions accepting the pay offer. The RCN haven't, not by a very small margin, they haven't really got enough justification to now call more strikes. I mean, they will portray that as a split.
Well, we've got to wait and see, because a number of our other unions in the health service, I mean, Unite, the GMB, the physiotherapists, others, are actively consulting their members now. And I don't want to cut across that, Ian, because ultimately the decision about whether the deal that's on the table is good enough, and clearly Unison members thought it was good enough, lies with union members, and it's their decision. It's not my decision. It's not union leadership's decision. It's their decision. I mean, what will happen at the beginning of May is all of those unions, including the RCM, will come together and they'll weigh up, the weighted vote. Is this an offer that we can accept collectively as a group of unions? And so I think the key thing is let that process play out. But you've got to appreciate...
Could that in effect negate the Unison vote?
Well, Unison and all of those unions have agreed that it will be on a weighted vote, and it will depend on the outcomes of the ballots across the piece. And so, at the end of the day, I mean, and Unison will tell you this very clearly, they thought that this was the best deal that they could get their members through negotiation. They weren't popping champagne corks because of that deal, but it meant real hard cash for their members who've been through really difficult times over the last few months. Members fought hard to get the offer from the government. They voted for action. They took action. As I say, it's now down to other unions to cast their votes. And, I think... I don't want to cut across that process. I mean, this is the key thing about unions. We're democratic organisations. At the end of the day, decisions aren't taken by me, they're taken by members.
Are you surprised that the public, and I'm going to grossly generalise here, but it seems to me, and I take anecdotal evidence from the phone-ins that we do here, but also what you hear on the rest of the media, that the general public seem to be quite supportive of a lot of these strikes in a way that I think 10, 20, 30 years ago they wouldn't have been. Why do you think that is, if you agree with me?
Yeah, no, I do agree with you, and I've seen it firsthand on picket lines, whether it's physios or paramedics or it's civil servants. I mean, huge public support. I think, actually, the person who's miscalculated this is being the Prime Minister, because I think he tried to dust off the old sort of 1980s anti-union playbook, unions on one hand, the public on the other. I mean, the key thing is, Ian, our members are the public as well. I mean, our nurses use trains, our railway workers rely on our schools and our hospitals. And I think everybody listening to your show tonight will know a nurse, will know a paramedic, a teacher, a civil servant. These aren't some, militant ogres over in the corner. They're our friends, our families, our neighbours. So I think the government has miscalculated, and I think they really did miscalculate in not coming to the table and negotiating on these deals earlier. We could have resolved a lot of these disputes a long time ago. And the fact we haven't, I think the responsibility lies with government.
Do you not also think that there has been a degree? Well, you're not going to say yes to this, I know.
Go on. Let's see what the question is.
Sorry, I should have worded it a bit differently.
Don't trail it for me beforehand.
The 35% pay rise. I mean, if you were an employer, you would laugh that out of court. Do you not think that the junior doctors have actually made could be catastrophic strategic error by demanding that? I mean, they say, well, it's because of the losses that we've incurred since 2010, which to a degree I can see, although I think they're using a slightly different calculation of inflation than most people do. But even leaving that aside, they were never going to get anywhere near 35%. So why not ask for something that would have been realistic and say, well, look, but on top of that, we want you to commit over the next few years to restoring our pay. We know you can't do it in one go. We're not naive, but it just shows a degree of naivety, I think.
Well, again, the British Medical Association isn't affiliated to the TUC.
Why not?
We do represent some junior doctors through the HCSA, which is the Hospital Consultants Union. I think
if you don't represent them, you can give a really honest answer.
I am never going to undermine any other union's negotiating position. I think what the junior doctors were rightly trying to do was to expose the real terms pay cut that their members have suffered over a number of years. And it's not just junior doctors, Ian. I mean, the average public sector worker is £200 a month worse off now than they were 2 years ago. In real terms, that's unprecedented. It's never happened before in our recent economic history, but certainly in the last 200 years, depending on your definition of recent. So this is long-term pay pressures that aren't a year or two in the making. They've been a decade or more in the making. And the crucial thing is this. We've got a big staffing crisis in our NHS, 133,000 vacancies, 170,000 vacancies in social care, which makes a difference because we can't discharge people from hospitals into care homes because we've not got the people to care for people in those settings. Another real terms pay cut isn't going to solve that staffing crisis, and the government has to recognise that and has got to have a plan for fixing that staffing crisis in the NHS and social care.
I mean, that is a big subject, of course, because as you and I both know, it's not just about pay. It is about more general working conditions.
Yep.
And that's something that cannot be solved just over one pay deal, can it? I mean, I've talked to so many people on the programme, junior doctors, consultants, surgeons, many of whom are considering leaving the NHS, some of whom already have. But that's not something you can solve overnight. There's no way the government could turn around tomorrow and say, OK, well, we're going to restore you 35%. We're going to make your working conditions better by doing X, Y and Z. That isn't going to happen in the real world, is it?
Well, maybe no government can click its fingers and say we're going to solve all the problems in the NHS overnight. But what they can do is give people a decent pay rise in the here and now. They can listen to the concerns of those staff and they can set out jointly with the unions and the staff of the NHS, here's our plan to fix the problems. And for months, I mean, literally, ministers had their hands over their ears saying, no, we can't hear you. Pay review bodies reported, nothing to do with us, Gov, off you go. And we've wasted months now. We've had months of disruption, not just in the NHS, in education, in the civil service, where frankly the government hasn't made any move at all, where morale is at rock bottom and the responsibility lies firmly with the government. And I said when I started in January, the first thing I said is that Rishi Sunak needs to get round the table with the unions and resolve these disputes. It took him weeks to come to the table after unions, sort of dragged them kicking and screaming. And we're still no closer to resolving some of these disputes. That's the government's responsibility.
When you took the job on, did you have a clear idea of thinking, well, look, I'm going to be in this job probably 5-7 years, whatever?
Well, I'm not putting a timescale on it just yet.
Well, let's for argument's sake, let's say 5 to 7 years. What was your main ambition? Is it to grow union membership over that? Well, obviously you want to grow union membership, but is that going to be one of your priorities, or have you got something else in mind?
Well, absolutely. Well, listen, I'm not going to give you the TUC PowerPoint presentation about my strategic priorities. I'll save that for another show. But, number one, supporting members.
You do it with James O'Brien one day.
Yeah, maybe. Now, I'm not going to say anything against James O'Brien. My mum loves James O'Brien. Shout out to Anne in Birkenhead if she's listening.
Everybody's mum does.
So, number one was supporting members through the cost of living crisis. Number two was supporting the right to strike and pushing back on the attacks on our employment rights. 3 was securing political change, and we can talk about that maybe a little bit later on. Yep. But underpinning all of that, we need a stronger, growing, more diverse, more representative trade union movement, because that's what makes the difference in workplaces day in, day out. And we've won lots of really good deals in the private sector over the last few months because we've had well-organised unions in part of the private sector. What I want to do is grow trade unionism, get more people in the trade union family and make a difference in workplaces.
Apart from the fact that you're a man and she is a woman, how are you different from Frances O'Grady? How different will your approach be? Bearing in mind you were her deputy as well.
Yeah, and we worked together for over 20 years, and Frances is a good friend as well as a colleague. I think what's different is the circumstances that we're in. Now, Frances had a difficult shift as TUC General Secretary. She had austerity, she had Brexit, she had the anti-trade union bill, she had the pandemic. I've inherited things during the midst of this cost of living crisis and a wave of industrial action. Maybe one difference is that I might be dealing with a more supportive government sometime over the course of the next 18 months, 2 years. Frances had 10 years of Conservative-led government. So, we all bring different things to the job. There's things that she was great at that I'm not so good at, things I think that I'm strong on. But I think ultimately it's about adapting to the changing environment rather than saying we're going to rip things up and start all over again.
Well, we'll talk about a possible future Labour government, what that means for the union movement in just a moment. But also we'll be coming to your calls, 0345 6060 973, if you'd like to talk to Paul over the course of the next 45 minutes about the future of trade unionism, the various strikes that are happening at the moment. And we keep hearing from trade union leaders, the last thing we want to do is go on strike. A lot of people sometimes think, well, OK, well, don't then. Find another way of negotiating a good pay deal. Or is there no other way? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You're listening to LBC. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
To help Paul Nowak is with me, General Secretary of the TUC. Came into the job in January, having been Francis O'Grady's deputy, as we said. Tell us a bit about you, about your background.
Oh, where'd you start? I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that nobody leaves school saying, you know what, I want to be General Secretary of the TUC. This wasn't what I expected I was going to do for my working life. And I'm incredibly proud and privileged to do this job, but it wasn't what I set out to do. So
what did you set out to do?
I didn't really have much of an idea, to be honest with you. When I was in school, and I started working in Asda at the age of 17. That's where I first joined the union. But I had illusions of being a glaciologist, somebody who measured.
It's not too late.
Yeah, maybe. Well, the fact I got an E grade in geology at A level,
that's
probably
not good. It's why I'm not an economist. I did the same in economics.
And so as I say, started working Asda, and I found out whatever job I went to, I became a union member and a union activist. Sort of last job I did,
troublemaker.
But sort of a troublemaker with the heart in the right place. And last job I did, I worked in Cheshire County Council on the bus information line. And then Francis O'Grady, who we just talked about, advertised this thing called the TUC Organising Academy. It was an attempt to really bring in some new blood into the trade union movement. I joined the TUC through the Organising Academy. Sharon Graham at Unite joined through the Organising Academy. Ros Foyer, who's my counterpart up in Scotland, joined. A whole raft of other people. And I've been working for unions in the TUC ever since. And as I say, I mean, it's one of those things where genuinely, I know it sounds corny, but I do pinch myself every day that I get up to and do what I do,
And you come from Merseyside?
Yeah, and still live there, so I still live in
How does that work, though? Because obviously a lot of your work must be London-based for obvious reasons.
It just means I've spent the last 20 years leaving home on a Sunday night or a Monday morning, going back on a Thursday, a Friday, a Saturday, or not going back. And that's, I've been married to Vicky, my partner, now for 25 years. We've managed to make that work. We've got 3 kids. I like getting on that train on a Thursday night or a Friday going back north.
Well, this is breaking news. You like getting on an Avanti West Coast train?
Yeah, it's been trying at times. It's been trying at times. And I've become a bit of a nerd about which services are more reliable than others. But, I say, I couldn't wish for a better job. I mean, if it was 250 miles further, to the north, it would be even better. But most of the work is down here.
We're going to come to calls in a minute, I promise. 0345 6060 973. But I do want to talk about how things might be different under a Labour government, because it is not beyond the realms of possibility that in the next 18 months, I'm assuming the next election is most likely to be October, November next year.
Yeah, maybe.
At the moment, OK, the polls are narrowing a little bit, but I would still say that it's a probability rather than a possibility that Labour will be elected. First of all, what do you want to see from a Labour government? I mean, what do you want to see a Labour government do for unions?
Well, I want a Labour government to address some of those issues that we talked about before. I mean, we've got to address this cost of living crisis. We need to get wages rising again. And to do that, I think we have to reset the balance of power in Britain's workplaces. And Labour, Keir came to our Congress last year, Angela came to our Congress, set out very clearly a new deal for work. And it would be, basic things like a ban on 0 hours contracts, a ban on fire and rehire, day one employment rights, union rights to access the workplace, new fair pay agreements so that we're negotiating terms and conditions across whole sectors. I mean, I think it's a pretty exciting package and one that Labour have committed to deliver in that first 100 days. So,
well, they've committed to delivering everything that you've just said.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
they've hidden that very well.
Well, I don't think it's being hidden away at all, but I do want them to talk about it, and I want our unions to talk about it loud and proud as well, because I think a Labour government that did deliver that sort of agenda in the first 100 days would send a very clear message right across Britain's workplaces to employers and employees alike that things are going to be different, and they should be different, because our members have had this sort of unprecedented, as I say, in squeeze on wages at a time when, it's not been a cost of living crisis for everybody. FTSE 100 chief executives saw their pay go up 23% last year alone, 39% the year before. Dividends have grown 3 times faster than wages. The people who are being asked to pick up the bill are our members, and we want to put that right.
Let's just go through those things that you just mentioned there. Let's start with the first one.
A ban on fire and rehire. And
I'd say I totally agree with that.
Yeah, and we're just over a year now, aren't we, from 786 seafarers being sacked by P&O without notice, without consultation. The government promised absolute blue murder. What happened? No fines, no prosecutions. The directors at P&O shared £15 million bonus pot between them last year, and the government's just awarded DP World the co-contract to run the Thames Freeport. I mean, they've got away with it scot-free.
OK, so that's one which I think would generally be popular. Next.
Ban on 0 hours contracts.
See, I have a problem with that, in that there are quite a lot of people, whenever we talk about 0 hours contracts on the programme, I get people phoning in saying, well, I can see why some people would want them banned, but actually for me, it's quite good because I'm a single mum, or I'm a mother with kids at school and I want to be able to choose how many hours I work, or I'm a student, etc., etc. So there are lots of people who quite like the flexibility that they give.
And no one wants to take away the flexibility from those who are genuinely working freelance, who are genuinely opting to work in that way. But we've got so many people who have got no choice but to go to work, not knowing from one week to another how many hours they're going to get and what that means in their pay packet at the end of the day. And so, I think that those 0 hours contracts have driven huge insecurity in Britain's workplaces. I think sending the message that the default should be that people get guaranteed hours.
But a blanket ban, you're saying to my single mum and you're saying to my student that, well, sorry, you won't be able to have those contracts anymore.
No, and I think there will always be the flexibility, but what we're going to do is ban the abuse of 0 hours contracts and ban their being the default. I mean, and we're seeing the chickens come home to roost, I have to say, in some sectors like bars and hotels where staff have been on 0 hours contracts, and then all of a sudden now we've got a squeeze on the labour market. Employers can't find staff. Well, funnily enough, if you would have put them on proper hours and proper contracts, those staff would probably still be here. So I think it's good for the people we represent, but it's good for businesses as well. And other countries have done this. In Spain, they've done, taken forward legislation to regulate platform companies, the use of these precarious contracts. If you can do it there, you can do it here as well.
Next.
Union rights to access the workplace digitally and physically. I mean, it's bizarre that in this country you can have union members in the workplace, but unions have got no right to access that workplace, no right to access members through things like company intranet systems, and it's part of the reasons why we struggle to organise. I've been there, Ian, when you stood on a roundabout outside a distribution centre trying to get people to take leaflets, and so a basic thing.
Difficult on a roundabout.
Yeah, well, they slow down, you see. That's the point, though. They slow down. But, I don't mean unions just turning up, knocking on the door and saying, I'd like to come in. But with proper notice and proper arrangements, unions having the right to go into workplaces, to talk to workers about unions and to give people the option to join.
Every workplace, no matter how small?
I think it should be every workplace, but we'd have to think about how it works in practice. But, yeah, every workplace.
You see, that's the one, of all the ones that you've said so far, that's the one that the Conservatives would bounce on and say, back to the 70s.
I don't think that is the one. I mean, I think the one that will get pushback on from the Tory backbenchers and certainly from some employers' organisations is employment rights from day one. But I think it's absolutely essential that people have the same rights when they start work as they would get. I mean, now you have to work 2 years before you get protection against unfair dismissal. Not protection against dismissal on the grounds of performance or anything else. Unfair dismissal, 2 years. I think if you're an employer and you haven't made your mind up in 2 years if someone's no good, then you're not doing your job.
The Blair government reduced it to 1 and then Cameron put it back up to 2.
He did, yeah. And we think it needs to be a day one right, and that would give people certainty when they go into workplaces and give people basic respect when they go into work.
See, I have a bit of a problem with that. I think that if you've got a sort of month or 3-month trial period, surely that you as an employer, you have to be able to get rid of somebody in that trial period if you don't feel that they are working properly, that they're not going to fit in.
Well, listen, I'm not going to do employers' jobs for them, but they'd still be able to do that. The point is that people would have protection against unfair dismissal. And so if you don't think somebody's cutting the mustard and you've got a probationary period, you can set out very clearly how that probation period will work, how people will be monitored and assessed. What you wouldn't be able to do is sack them unfairly. And I think that's the crucial thing. We are protecting people against unfair dismissal. So, as I say, this is, again, commonplace around the globe, and if other countries can do it, it's not beyond the wit of British employers to do it either.
Right, let's go to Pauline in Watford for our first call. Hello, Pauline.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hi,
My
Pauline.
question is, considering my knowledge of ACAS being an organisation that has resolved difficult situations with employers and employees for decades, in my knowledge, I don't know exactly when ACAS started. I don't understand the intransigence of Barclay and Company in not allowing negotiations with ACAS and the junior doctors. I just don't get it. Is it a sinister act?
Well, hi, Pauline. Just to say, I was also on the council of ACAS for 11 years, and they do some brilliant work. And most of the work they do, you don't hear about it, doesn't make the headlines, but they resolve disputes day in, day out in the public and the private sector. I mean, the government, this is just part of a wider pattern of behaviour, I'm afraid, Pauline, where they've had to be dragged kicking and screaming to the negotiating table. And I think if the government's got nothing to hide and nothing to worry about, I think you're right. Maybe they should call in ACAS. Maybe they should call on other independent arbitrators, something to unlock these disputes. But, quite to the contrary, we've had months now of government refusing to come to the table. I mentioned the civil service just to say, we've got hundreds of thousands of civil servants who've taken strike action, who are about to take strike action. The government has just refused to negotiate point blank on pay in the civil service. And I think that's incredibly damaging to morale and motivation in the civil service. And our teaching unions did call on the government to go through ACAS. So I think if I was in government, I'd be doing anything I could to get these disputes resolved and to get to a fair settlement.
30 years ago, I co-wrote a think tank pamphlet with David Davis on the concept of pendulum bargaining, which was where the employers would put forward an offer and the unions would say what they wanted, and the arbitrators had to pick one or the other. So there was no sort of middle ground. They'd pick one or the other. And the premise was that if you had that, then both sides would be much more reasonable and wouldn't put maybe 35% pay demands forward, or wouldn't put 2% when inflation's 10%. I mean, it's never really caught on. I think we were ahead of our time, don't you?
I'm not going to commit to quite that, to be honest with you. I think it has been used in the past. But, the key thing is, whatever the mechanism is, and, at the moment I know that the CW, the Postal Workers Union, I know you know Dave Ward very well, they're considering the agreement that they've just, negotiators agreement they've reached with Royal Mail. That took a lot of hard work. Brendan Barber, who used to be the chair of ACAS, used to be my predecessor, one of my predecessors at the TUC, has spent some time with both the CWU and Royal Mail getting to that agreement. And I think, sometimes you do need to think imaginatively about how you're going to unlock these things. But at the end of the day, the government started off saying there is nothing else we're going to put on the table, and that is not the starting point for a negotiation.
Right, we're going to take more of your calls immediately. We come back from the news. It's 8:31 on LBC. I'm with Paul Nowak, General Secretary of the TUC, 0345 6060 973. But first, news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
Rishi Sunak's delayed making a decision about Dominic Raab's future as Deputy Prime Minister as he considers a report about his behaviour. A top lawyer's completed an investigation into bullying allegations which Mr Raab denies. Taiwan's Foreign Minister has told LBC the West must not make the same mistake with China as it has with Russia. Joseph Roux says countries such as the UK must come together to deal with threats to the self-ruling island, which Beijing considers part of its territory. And Elon Musk's SpaceX says its launch of the world's biggest ever rocket was a success, even though it exploded just after 4 minutes. It was the first unmanned test flight of a new Starship, which it hopes will one day be ferrying people to Mars. LBC weather: patchy rain and heavy showers moving across the south tonight, staying dry for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England, and a low of 0.
This is LBC.
We're with Paul Nowak, General Secretary of the TUC. Is it the Trades Union Congress or the Trade Union Congress?
Trades Union Congress.
I thought it was, because I always say Trade Union. I know that's sort of in the back of my mind. I think, no, that's wrong.
I just always say TUC.
Probably easiest, isn't it? Now, as I said before, Paul's been in the job for 3 months. It's been a baptism of fire with all the different disputes that are happening among his member organisations and indeed some unions that aren't members. I mean, why aren't the RCN and BMA members of the TUC?
Well, I think it's just for historical reasons. I mean, the RCN, for all of its history until very recently, had a policy of never taking industrial action. And I think that was one of the reasons that they stayed apart from the TUC. I think the BMA is slightly different case in point. I mean, many of their members will effectively be self-employed. We do represent self-employed people, whether they be actors or musicians or cab drivers. But I think both those organisations at different points in their history have talked about affiliation to the TUC, and everybody's welcome in the TUC family. I mean, the bigger, better the trade union movement, from my point of view, I'm well up for it. Right,
let's go to Munesh, who's in Southall. Hello, Munesh.
Hello, Ian. Good evening, and good evening to you, Paul.
Evening.
First of all, I want to congratulate you on your job, and I wish you all the best. I grew up in Southall, but I've always been a Liverpool supporter.
Oh, right, man. We're not going to talk about football. Let's agree on that.
I know. But look, I'm just wondering, do you have any kind of records or correlation where you can correlate the direct proportionality between inflation and wage inflation? And do you have any concerns of how this can be spiraling out of control? Is that something that you've considered? I know you represent the workers, but how about thinking in some instances you have to look on the other side of the employer of what they're doing and what's going to cost them and how it's going to affect the whole economy?
Yeah, absolutely, Manesh. And I think one of the first things for any union negotiator is you have to put yourself in the shoes of the employer as well. And that's why in the private sector, I think we've seen some really good pay deals because employers have been able to afford to pay their staff more, and they have paid their staff more. And we've had bus drivers, for example, who've won pay rises of 12, 13, 14%. The employers were profitable; they could afford to pay more. Now, there's a broader question if you think about the national economy. There is just no credible evidence at all, Manesh, that it's workers' wages at the moment that are driving inflation in this country. It doesn't matter whether it's bus drivers or supermarket workers or nurses or paramedics. I mean, food inflation is running at 20%. We all know what's happened to energy bills. They're the real inflationary pressures in our economy. And what it means is that our members every single month are finding it harder to make ends meet because their wages aren't matching inflation. So, I mean, we've got a situation where, I've said this before, not everybody's experienced the cost of living crisis in this country. I mean, one of the things that always sticks in my mind, this isn't a particularly scientific fact, but I'll give it you anyway. Porsche motor cars had their best ever year for sales in the UK last year. Their sales went up by a third. At a time when millions of families are struggling to get by, somebody is doing okay. And I think we need to talk about fair taxation, and we need to talk about how we get wages rising. And I'm afraid under this government, and it doesn't matter whether it's Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, David Cameron, this government has done nothing to get real people's wages rising, and I think that's on their watch.
Do you have any real confidence, though, that Keir Starmer would? Because it seems to me that he's playing very much safety first, don't frighten the electoral horses, making very few real commitments on anything at the moment. Now, they always say, yes, but we're not writing our manifesto 18 months before an election. Fair enough. But you've got to put a bit of meat on the bone to give people a bit of an idea that you have a vision of what you want to do.
Now, you see, I have a golden rule, Ian. I mean, I wouldn't want to turn on the radio and hear Keir Starmer tell me how to do my job. So I'm not going to tell him how to do his job. But I will give you my tuppence worth.
Plenty of union leaders have in the past.
As General Secretary of the TUC, that new deal for workers that I talked about before, I think would go a long way towards getting wages rising again in this country. We desperately need to get wages rising. There's been wage pressures across economies, but I mean, we've fallen well behind the G7 and OECD countries on wages. I want Labour to, as we go into the next election, and I understand the argument about 12 months out, 18 months, you don't publish your detailed plans around things like taxation. But I would want Labour going into the next election saying, how are we going to afford investment in our public services? How are we going to afford to rebuild our economy, invest in the green economy? And that's going to mean, some different choices on things like taxation. And other governments around the world have introduced wealth taxes.
Rachel Reeves is saying she's not going to put taxes up.
Well, I'll continue to make the case. I mean, I think that there is an absolute case for things like capital gains tax being equalised with income tax. I can't see how it's tenable that the Prime Minister pays the same effective tax rate as one of our paramedics. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. The more income you've got, the more tax you should pay. And I think those with the broader shoulders should expect to do that.
When was the last time you spoke to Keir Starmer?
Last time I spoke directly to Keir was probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago.
And, I mean, obviously, there is a sort of media angle to this, isn't there? Because we still use this phrase, beer and sandwiches at number 10, sort of days of Len Murray and all the rest in the 1970s, sort of trotting into Downing Street and people perceiving them as actually running the country. And even though it's 40 years ago or whatever, there's still that feeling among sort of older generations that it was the unions that were wagging the tail of the government, and that could happen again under a Labour government. Now, to younger people listening to this, they'll think, oh, that's utterly ridiculous. But, I mean, you're a lot younger than I am, but you will know of those days.
Well listen, let me tell you, the last time I had refreshments in Downing Street, it was bacon butties and Danish pastries, and it was Rishi Sunak that was providing them when he was Chancellor. Now, he hasn't invited me back as Prime Minister, and we've still got an extended, we're still waiting for that invitation. Listen, I think where is our legitimacy rooted in? It's the fact that we represent 5.5 million, 6 million people at work. And I think any government of any political persuasion should be listening to the voice of people at work. And I say this constantly, Ian, but I mean, I have to work as TUC General Secretary with whoever is the Prime Minister, whoever is the government of the day. And I've got one thing that drives me alone, which is making sure that our members' voices are listened to and that politicians deliver for people at work.
Ritesh says, I'm sorry, but what is Paul on about when he talks of fair taxation? I'm in the 45% tax bracket. How much more does he want us to get taxed?
Well, I talked not about income tax, Ritesh. I talked about equalising capital gains tax with income tax. I think most people would accept it's fair that those people who derive their income, for example, from shares or from property should pay the same rate of tax as those who go out to work every single day. I think that's fundamentally fair. I'd like to see the corporations pay more. We've talked about a proper windfall tax on the profits of the oil and gas and energy giants. I think that's absolutely something the government should do. And I think the corporate Britain needs to pay its fair share as well. So let's have the debate about fair taxation. What I can tell you now is that the people I represent have had a decade or more now of declining real incomes. Now, that's bad for them. It's bad for the UK economy overall because, funnily enough, it's our members who go out and spend the money in the local shops, the local bars, the local restaurants, who employ local builders and local plumbers. And if our members haven't got money in their pockets, then local economies suffer.
And another text from Sandra who says, does your guest think that a new specific pay scale for nurses is a good idea? And where does this leave the rest of the workforce when it comes to negotiating pay deals? Well, there is a specific pay scale for nurses.
Yeah, well, no, they're part of a comprehensive pay framework in the NHS called Agenda for Change. And I would be very wary about disrupting Agenda for Change because at the end of the day, the NHS works as a whole. And it's absolutely right that we think about the pay of not just nurses, but also radiographers and dietitians and physiotherapists and support staff, within that wider framework. And so, I'm not interested in driving wedges between different groups of workers. I don't think it's a case of a pay rise for nurses or a pay rise for paramedics. I want us to address that staffing crisis in the NHS. That requires the plan I talked about before, and it requires paying people more.
But it also requires more than £3.1 billion, which Rachel Reeves says she'll get from taxing non-DOMs. I mean, you cannot reform the health service. You cannot pay people better just with £3.1 billion. And a lot of people doubt whether they should even get that from the non-DOM issue.
Well, and I think it's also fair to say that it's not just about putting additional resources into the NHS. I mean, I talked before about social care. if you don't solve the crisis in social care, you can carry on putting more money into the NHS, but fundamentally we've got a broken social care system and a system that is being staffed by people who are quite often on very low wages, insecure contracts, care being placed on the back burner because we haven't got the staff to provide the care that people require. Likewise, Ian, with our local councils. I mean, sort of tens of billions of pounds have been sucked out of local councils. What happens when you can't provide drug and alcohol services in local communities? People turn up at A&E and hospitals. So you've got to think about public services in the round, including, I think, actually the role of our civil service, which is quite often the bit that people forget about. But it's the people working in Whitehall, in the Department for Education, in the Department of Health, who I think are part of the solution to these problems.
We'll have much more from Paul Nowak, General Secretary of the TUC, in just a moment. Keep your calls coming. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:46.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Saturday's Grand National at Aintree, and some of the protesters who sparked considerable outrage by trying to halt the race have now put out a video saying police and security staff were too rough with them. They claim that some of them were pepper sprayed, suffered broken bones, or even bitten by dogs. Everyone has a right to protest, and I would protect that to my dying breath. But when other people's rights to enjoy a piece of theatre, enjoy a piece of art, enjoy a sporting event, when they are impinged, surely they take action. If you hadn't tried to climb a fence, then you wouldn't be complaining about hurt collarbones.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
Fancy a quick
Paul Nowak is with us, General Secretary of the TUC. Just before we come back to your texts and calls, Sandra says, Ian, no pirate eye patch, so hopefully the eye surgery went okay. Thank you for asking, Sandra. If you were listening last night, you'll know that I had some laser treatment on one of my eyes this morning. I can see that it's Paul Nowak in front of me. It's a bit blurry, but I can see that he's there.
It's probably better that I am blurry.
Now, I want to ask you about what's happening at the CBI, which is effectively your sort of counter-organisation in the business world, because I thought the SNP had a few problems, but the CBI, just seems to be imploding. More revelations day after day. Has it made you think that maybe, and I'm not making any allegations or suggestions here, but I think a lot of organisations are looking at themselves thinking, well, does this happen in our organisation? Do we need to look at the way we operate and our guidelines for what's acceptable in the workplace and isn't?
I have to tell you, Ian, it's a wake-up call to lots of organisations. I started the job in January, and one of the first things I said is that the trade union movement had to be a zero-tolerance environment for sexual harassment. Now, we've had problems of our own. In February, there was a report into one of our unions around sexual harassment and bullying. I think that report was shaming for that union, but it's not restricted to one union or one individual. And so I've been very clear that we have to get our house in order as well. And we've been working hard with our unions on that. Back in February, before all this broke at the CBI, I got agreement from our executive, the body that leads the TUC, that we would put in place a process that people could use with confidence. If they had complaints about my conduct, it's up there on the website. People can put that complaint in directly. It will go to our executive. Nothing gets hidden away. And we've also been very clear that we would never use, for example, non-disclosure agreements if people exited the organisation because they made a complaint about us around sort of sexual harassment or racial discrimination. I think we all have to take responsibility for our organisations. Sexual harassment's out there in workplaces. I'm afraid women listening to this programme, overwhelmingly, the majority of them will have experience of that in the workplace, and the trade union movement isn't immune to that. The CBI clearly isn't immune to that, but all of us who lead organisations have got to do what we can to say it's not just we need to tackle it, we are going to tackle it, and we're going to stamp it out.
And I think that's been the case in other areas too. When you look at what's happening in the Metropolitan Police about racism, homophobia, misogyny, the FBU, they've had their issues in some of those areas, and they are tackling it and are quite open about what's going on, which I think is a good thing, because if you try and hide it away, it just makes the problem worse, doesn't it?
You absolutely can't hide it away, and you have to front it up. And I've used every union conference, every union executive I've spoken to over the last few weeks, and I've talked about the issues around sexual harassment, because genuinely I want the trade union movement to be somewhere where women feel safe, included, that this is a movement for them, and if it's not a movement that's fit for purpose in my opinion. So, I want women to have confidence in the TUC and the trade union movement.
What's the proportion of female to male union membership at the moment?
We've got more women in membership than men. I think women are...
That wouldn't have been the case 30 years ago.
No, it wouldn't have been the case, and actually what we're also seeing is women come through into our leadership positions, so people like Sharon at Unite and Christina at Unison and Jo at the UCU and other brilliant women coming through, and that's absolutely what we need. And not stopping there, I said before, I want more black workers sat around our leadership tables. I want more black activists, because I want the TUC to look like Britain at work, to sound like Britain at work, to be Britain at work, and that's a key part of renewing the trade union movement, really.
Right, let's go to Lewis in Plymouth. Lewis, good evening. What would you like to ask Paul?
Yes, good evening, gentlemen. It's relevant to these zero-hour contracts. I can speak on behalf of my daughter, who owns a care company. We would openly love zero contracts to be banned. The problem is our staff wouldn't. And so it does give me a slight concern when we talk, and I understand about the principle of zero contracts is not great, and I fully support that. But the situation we have is that when you have an industry in care where you are grossly short of staff, there are many, many hours available for staff to have whenever they want. The other issue is with zero-hour contracts, if a person's having full-time employment over the year, they end up with the same conditions. They end up with the same holiday conditions, the basic holiday entitlement that most of everybody has, which is 4 weeks plus bank holidays paid, just like everybody else. The advantage they have is if they need some childcare, they give a couple of weeks' notice. They don't work. If they have someone ill and they need to care for them, they can pick and choose if they wish. And so my daughter's been offering full-time contracts, part-time contracts to all her staff for the last 4 years, and the only people that are on that take full-time contracts are the managers. the staff do not want to do that. So the question I'd ask you, if you have make a blanket decision, the statutories prevent zero-hour contracts, within the care industry, there are going to be a lot of disgruntled people because it works to their benefit.
Oh, okay, Lou. So, well, listen, thanks for the point. I mean, what I would say to you is that it is possible, and in fact, we've got lots of people who have access to flexible work, and whether it's for childcare or for caring commitments, who aren't on 0 hours contracts. And I think there's a broader issue, and you talked about it in terms of understaffing across social care. I talked about those fair pay agreements before, and one of the sectors where I think we need a fair pay agreement is in social care. Because then we can address these issues around the types of contracts people have got and finding contracts that work for people, the pay that people have got, the margins of providers like yourself, because lots of care providers are trying to do the right thing, but they're not getting enough money off the local authority.
Right. They can't employ the staff properly, they can't train them properly because the local authority payment it's just not viable.
Yeah, so I would sort of on top of what I was talking about in terms of 0 hours contracts, I think actually having a clear framework. I talked about agenda for change in the health service. I think we need something equivalent in social care where we've got a clear idea about career progression. I want social care to be a job that people really want to do, that they're valued, that they feel it's a profession that people value as well. I hate it when people describe it as low skilled work, because it's not low skilled. It's incredibly skilled at work. You need to be dedicated to that work. So I think we'd probably be in agreement on lots of issues about, we need to raise standards overall. I think that you can do that with a ban on 0 hours contracts across the economy, but I get the point that at the moment for lots of people, they see that flexibility as being important, and I think there's ways that you need to build that in.
It seems to me that this idea of a ban is not viable, that there will have to be a lot of exemptions from the ban.
Well, I think it's about the inappropriate use of 0 hours contracts, but that's hard to put on a badge, Ian.
Well,
to be
indeed,
fair.
but I suppose that's what legislators are there to do, to legislate and find ways through it. Lewis, thank you very much. This is a text, says, I'm a nurse that supports the strikes. I'm part of a team that has a Conservative MP visiting the hospital soon for a photo op. What would Paul recommend I say to the MP?
Well, keep it polite. But you know what? I absolutely think I'd say to the MP, don't just come here for a photo op. Come and talk to me and to my colleagues about what the experience is like working in the NHS, because I've been, and I think I've been around the block a few times, and I think I knew what was happening in the NHS. And standing on those picket lines with physios and paramedics and others, you hear the stories. People who can't afford to put petrol in their cars to come into work. People feeling absolutely stressed out, going home in tears because they can't provide the care that they want to provide, feeling overworked and overwhelmed every single day. It's not good enough for patients. It's not good enough for staff. And I think local MPs, rather than just standing, coming along for selfies, should talk to staff, respect staff, and tell them to go back to the Prime Minister and deliver that long-term plan for staff and for pay in the NHS.
Now, final text from Steve, who says, a great 2 hours tonight. I didn't expect to get the China-Taiwan discussion, yet found it fascinating. Then your interview with the TUC chief, maybe not a political bedfellow, has been respectful, clear and informative. Well done, all. Well, it's always nice to have one satisfied customer.
Yeah, cheers, Steve. Thanks.
Well, Paul, thank you very much, because I think it's really important that union leaders do programmes like this and then sort of interact with the general public in a way that maybe you haven't been used to doing so much in the past. And this new breed of union leader, I think love doing it, basically. So
yeah, I mean, part of the job is talking to people, and part of the problem is shutting me up. But I've really welcomed the opportunity in, and thanks to every listener that's called in or sent a text.
Paul, thanks ever so
Cheers.
much. We'll have you back soon. That's Paul Nowak, General Secretary of the TUC. Now, it's 420 Day today. Have you got any idea what that means? Because until this afternoon, I hadn't. But I thought, this is too good an opportunity to pass up. Apparently, 420 means that you like having a puff of cannabis. And 420 Day is where cannabis smokers congregate in Hyde Park for an annual gathering that calls for drugs to be decriminalised. Well, I want to ask you the question in the next hour. Should cannabis not